My mother kicked me out at 16 to give the twins my room. Years later, she came back begging for money for their college, but I got a restraining order and left her speechless. I'm 33 years old. I work in senior management for a tech company, and I make more money than my 6-year-old self could have ever imagined. And when I say I make good money, I'm not being humble. Let's just say I have a 6-figure salary and benefits that most people only see in movies. But I need to tell this story because a few weeks ago, my mother showed up at my door demanding money. The same mother who literally threw me out on the street when I was a teenager, because she decided her other kids deserved more than me. And the way everything exploded, I mean, I still can't believe it. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I was like 11 years old and my mom Nancy met Walter. My biological dad, Jonathan, left before I was born. So basically I grew up just with my mom in a small apartment. Nancy worked in administration for an insurance company. Nothing spectacular, but it was enough for us. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. You know, middle class leaning towards lower. I remember Walter showed up at a party from my mom's office. He was an accountant or something like that, kind of quiet and serious. And honestly, I never liked him from the start. He had that vibe of a guy who smiles but with cold eyes, you know what I mean? But my mom was happy, I guess. And they got married when I was like 11 and a half. It wasn't a big wedding, just something at the courthouse with like 15 people. Things were okay at first, or at least they weren't terrible. Walter wasn't affectionate or anything, but he wasn't mean to me either. We basically just existed in the same space. I went to school, did my homework, helped around the house, the normal stuff. But when I was 12, my mom got pregnant with twins, and that's when everything really started to change. Nancy was super excited, and Walter too, like more excited than I'd ever seen him. And I tried to be happy for them. I really tried. But there was something about the way they talked about the babies, like they were this perfect miracle. And when they looked at me, it was like, different. I don't know how to explain it well, but I felt like something was breaking between us. The twins were born when I was 13. A boy and a girl, Liam and his sister. And look, I'm not gonna lie and say I hated them or anything. They were babies. They were cute. But the difference in how Nancy and Walter treated them compared to how they treated me became more and more obvious. Like, before my mom at least asked how school went or if I needed anything. But after the twins were born, it was like I was invisible. Everything was the babies this, the babies that. And I understood that babies need attention. Obviously. But it was like I had stopped existing completely. By the time I was 15, things were already pretty tense at home. Walter basically didn't speak to me unless it was to tell me to do something, and my mom was always busy with the twins or tired. I tried to help, really. I took care of the kids when they asked me to, cleaned, cooked sometimes, but it was never enough. And I started noticing that Nancy and Walter had conversations in low voices that stopped when I entered the room, which was super awkward and made me feel paranoid. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. All the signs were there, but I guess I didn't want to believe it. And then came the day that changed everything. I was 16 years old. It was like March or April. I think April because I remember it was hot. I came home from school on a normal Friday, left my backpack in my room and went to the kitchen to look for something to eat. Nancy and Walter were sitting at the kitchen table, and they had that serious face that adults make when they're going to tell you something bad. My mom said, "Amanda, sit down, we need to talk." And I sat there thinking, maybe I had done something wrong or someone had died. And then Walter started talking about finances, about how things were difficult with the twins, that the kids needed a lot of things, that the apartment was getting too small. Basically a bunch of excuses. And then my mom looked at me and said, "We need you to go live with your grandparents for a while." She didn't say it as a question. She said it as an order. And I just sat there like, what? My grandparents? My paternal grandparents had died when I was little, so I assumed she was talking about Arthur and Grace, her parents, but they lived like 2 hours away. And I asked why. And Walter was the one who answered with that cold voice he had. He said the twins needed my room, that they were going to convert the apartment so the kids would have more space, that I was almost an adult and could manage on my own. And the way he said it, like I was a piece of furniture they were removing to make room, hurt so much that it felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I asked my mom if she was serious, and she wouldn't even look me in the eyes. She just stared at the table and said it was best for everyone. That Arthur and Grace had said I could stay with them, that I could finish high school there. And I started crying. I couldn't help it. I told her, please don't do this to me. That it was my home. That we could share the room or I could sleep on the couch or whatever. But Walter stood up and said the decision was already made, that I had the weekend to pack my things, and that on Monday, Arthur would come pick me up. And then he added, looking at me directly with those cold eyes, the twins deserve more. They deserve to have a proper home and everything they need. Like I didn't deserve anything. Like I was less important because I wasn't his daughter. My mom finally looked at me and said this was temporary, that when things got better, maybe I could come back. But the way she said it sounded so fake that I knew it was a lie. I asked her if she was really going to choose them over me, and she got angry, told me not to put it like that she wasn't choosing anyone, that she was just doing what was best for the family. And I yelled at her. And what am I? Am I not part of the family? But she just shook her head and went to her room, and Walter looked at me and told me to stop being dramatic, that a lot of kids leave their homes at 16 and they're fine. I spent the whole weekend packing my things, crying. I had 2 big suitcases and like 3 cardboard boxes, basically my whole life in those containers. The twins, who were like 3 years old at that point, kept coming into my room asking what I was doing, and I didn't know what to tell them. Nancy and Walter basically avoided me, and when I tried to talk to my mom, she said we'd already talked enough. On Monday, Arthur arrived in his truck, an old Ford that made a weird noise, and we loaded all my stuff. My mom came out to say goodbye, hugged me quickly, and told me to call when I got there. But she didn't cry. She didn't look sad. She just looked relieved that I was leaving. That's what hurt the most, I think, that she looked relieved. Arthur and Grace, my maternal grandparents, lived in a small town about 2 hours from where I'd grown up. They had an old but nice 2-story house with a big yard and a dog named Max. They were kind to me from the beginning. They gave me the upstairs room that had been my mom's when she was young. They told me I could stay as long as I needed, and I was grateful. I really was, but I was also devastated. I changed schools in the middle of the school year, didn't know anyone, and every night I cried thinking about how my own mother had kicked me out of my home to give my room to my half-siblings. Arthur worked as a mechanic and Grace was a retired elementary school teacher. They didn't have much money, but they shared what they had with me without ever complaining. They enrolled me in the local school, helped me look for a part-time job, drove me everywhere because I didn't have a car. And little by little, I started to adapt, I guess. I got a job at a local coffee shop that paid minimum wage, but the tips were decent, and I started saving every penny I earned. Because right from that moment, at 16 years old, I decided I was going to make something of my life, that I was going to prove to Nancy and Walter that they had made the worst mistake of their lives by getting rid of me. I finished high school with good grades. Not excellent, but good enough to apply to college. And when it came time to fill out applications for financial aid, obviously I needed my parents' information. I called Nancy. It was the first time I'd talked to her in months because I had called a couple times after moving and the conversations were super awkward and short, so I'd stopped trying. I explained that I needed her information for the FAFSA and to apply for student loans, and she told me no, that they weren't going to help me with college, that if I wanted to go, I'd have to find my own way to pay for it. Can you believe it? And your own mother telling you to figure it out yourself? To pay for college. I told her I just needed her to sign the papers, that I wasn't even asking her for money. But she insisted no, that she and Walter were saving for the twins' college and couldn't risk it affecting their finances in any way. Which was ridiculous because signing the papers didn't cost them anything. But I think she just wanted to deny me anything that could help me. Or maybe she thought if she didn't help me, I'd give up and not go to college. I don't know. To this day, I don't understand her logic. I was desperate and angry and scared, because without that information, I couldn't even apply for financial aid. And then Grace talked to her sister, Catherine, my great-aunt technically, who lived in the city and worked as a school principal. Catherine was single, no kids, the kind of super independent and successful woman. And when Grace told her my situation, Catherine offered to help me. She told me I could use her information instead of Nancy's for some private loans, that she would co-sign with me, and that she'd help me with whatever she could. And this woman who barely knew me was willing to do more for me than my own mother. I got into college with a combination of student loans that Catherine co-signed, small scholarships I applied for like crazy, and working 2 jobs. I worked at the campus cafeteria during the day and at a restaurant on weekends, And during summers, I worked full-time at whatever I could find. I slept like 5 hours a night, lived on ramen and coffee, and basically had no social life because every free moment I used to study or work. I studied business administration because it seemed practical, something that would help me get a good job after. And I'm not going to lie. There were moments when I thought about giving up, when everything was too hard. But every time I thought about calling Nancy and admitting I couldn't do it alone, I remembered how she had thrown me out and it gave me more rage, and that rage gave me energy to keep going. Nancy never called to ask how I was, never offered help, basically acted like I didn't exist. I called Arthur and Grace every week because they had been incredible to me and I loved them. And sometimes Grace mentioned that Nancy had asked about me, but it was never Nancy who called directly. And I didn't call her either because, what for? She had clearly chosen her new family over me, and I was busy building my own life without her. Catherine became like a mother figure to me during those years. We'd go to lunch every month when I could go to the city. She gave me advice about my career, about finances, about life in general. She taught me how to budget, to invest the little I could save, to negotiate my salary when I got my first real job. And she never made me feel like a burden. Never threw it in my face that she had co-signed my loans. She just supported me because she wanted to. That's the difference between Nancy and Catherine. I think one gave me life, but the other taught me how to live it. I graduated from college at 22 with honors, something I was super proud of considering I'd worked practically full-time throughout my whole degree. I got a job at a medium-sized tech company in the operations department. It wasn't anything glamorous, but it paid well and had benefits. And from there, I just climbed. I mean, I worked hard, stayed late, learned everything I could, took on projects nobody else wanted. I changed jobs a couple times to get better positions and better salaries, and by the time I was 30, I was already in senior management, making like 3 times what Nancy and Walter made together. I bought my own house when I was 28. Nothing huge, but it's mine, in a nice neighborhood with good neighbors. I furnish it little by little with things I like. Quality things because I can finally afford them. And every time I walk into my house and see everything I accomplished alone, without Nancy's help, I feel proud but also sad, because part of me still wishes my mom had been there to see it, to be proud of me. But she chose not to be. So that's that. Arthur and Grace continued to be an important part of my life. I visited them often and helped them financially when I could, like paying for their car insurance or fixing things around their house. They protested, but I insisted. It was the least I could do for everything they'd done for me. Catherine also continued to be my favorite person. We had lunch together almost every month, and she was basically my best friend besides being my great aunt. And for years, everything continued like that. Me building my life. Nancy and hers with Walter and the twins, and with almost no contact between us. And then, like 6 months ago, Catherine mentioned my latest promotion at a family gathering. I think it was Christmas or something. Grace was there, and Nancy too, because, she was still Grace's daughter even if she was a terrible daughter. And Catherine, not knowing she was going to cause a problem, commented that I had just been promoted to director of operations and now had a team of like 40 people under my supervision. Grace was super proud, hugging me and saying how wonderful, and I could see Nancy sitting there with this weird face I couldn't decipher, like between surprise and something else. A few weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, I was at home in my pajamas watching Netflix when the doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there were Nancy and Walter, standing on my porch like nothing. Like almost 20 years hadn't passed since they kicked me out of their house. Nancy was like 53 years old at that point. She looked older than I remembered, and Walter still had those cold eyes that had always given me bad vibes. And before I could say anything, Nancy said, "Hi, Amanda, we need to talk to you," and started entering my house like she had a right to be there. I just stood there kind of frozen for a second because, was this really happening? But then I reacted and tell them what were they doing there? How had they gotten my address? Nancy completely ignored me and sat on my couch, looking around my house like evaluating everything. And Walter stood near the door. And then Nancy got straight to the point. Said the twins were going to start college next year and they needed help with tuition. She said Catherine had mentioned I was making good money now, and it would be nice if I could contribute to my siblings' education. The audacity. I mean, the absolute audacity of this woman. I told them they had to be kidding me. How dare they show up after almost 2 decades asking me for money? And Nancy put on that offended mother face and said, "We were family. That family helps each other." And I literally laughed in her face. I said, "Family? You're talking to me about family? You kicked me out when I was 16 years old. You told me your other kids deserved more than me. You refused to help me with college. You didn't even call me in years. And now you come, talking to me about family." Walter tried to interrupt with that condescending voice he used, saying I was being dramatic, that they had done the best they could at the time, and that was the past. And I told him to shut up, that he had no right to speak to me after how he'd treated me. I told him he'd said the twins deserved more, that I remembered it perfectly, every word. And Nancy started crying, like crocodile tears, saying she loved me, that she never wanted to hurt me, that circumstances had been difficult. And I could only think about all the nights I'd cried in that room at Arthur and Grace's house, all the times I worked double shifts to pay for my food, all the moments when I needed a mother and she wasn't there. I told them to leave my house, that I wasn't going to give them a single cent, that the twins could do the same thing I did, work and take out student loans. Nancy stood up and started yelling that I was selfish. How could I turn my back on my own family when they needed me most? And the irony was so absurd it almost made me laugh. I told her she had turned her back on me first, that she had chosen this, and now she had to live with the consequences. Walter called me a bitch, and I opened the door and told them to get out before I called the police. They finally left, but Nancy yelled from the yard that I was going to regret it, that I didn't know what she was capable of. I thought that was the end, but, of course, it wasn't. Like 2 days later, Nancy showed up at my work, like at the office, asking for me at reception. My assistant told me there was a woman saying she was my mother and needed to talk to me urgently, and I told her not to let her come up, to call security if necessary. And Nancy made a scene in the lobby, yelling that her daughter was rejecting her, that I was ungrateful, that she had given me life and I couldn't even help her with something so simple. Security had to escort her out of the building while she kept yelling, and it was super embarrassing, all the people staring and wondering what was happening. My boss called me to his office afterwards and I had to explain the situation. Basically, the whole story of how Nancy had abandoned me and now wanted money. He was understanding. Thank God. But he told me if she showed up again, we definitely had to involve the police for real. And I was furious, like shaking with rage, because Nancy had crossed a line going to my work, trying to embarrass me in front of my colleagues. But even after that, Nancy didn't stop. Like a week later, I was getting home from work, and there she was, sitting on my porch steps. And when she saw me, she started with this speech about how we needed to talk like adults, that she understood I was angry, but we had to think about the twins' future. I told her to leave or I'd call the police, and she stood up and started approaching me, saying I couldn't just ignore her, that I was her mother and deserved respect. And I backed up towards my car and took out my phone to call the police, and she tried to take my phone away, like literally tried to rip it from my hand. My neighbors came out because we were yelling, and Nancy was trying to grab me and I pushed her away, and she fell like dramatically onto the grass and started screaming that I had attacked her. One of my neighbors had already called the police because they thought someone was attacking me, and when they arrived, Nancy was there crying, saying her daughter had assaulted her, that she just wanted to talk to me and I had gotten violent. And I had to explain to the police the whole situation, that she had been harassing me, that she'd gone to my work, that she had tried to take my phone. The neighbors also gave their version, saying they'd seen Nancy try to grab me first. The police told Nancy she had to leave and not come back, that if she showed up again, she was going to be arrested for harassment. And I took the opportunity to ask them how I could get a restraining order, and they gave me information about the process. Nancy finally left, but she looked at me with so much hatred that I felt a chill. Like I'd never seen my own mother look at me like that. The neighbors were super nice to me afterwards. One of them even offered to check their home security cameras in case I needed evidence, which was very considerate. The next day, I went to court and filled out the papers for the restraining order. I had to write everything down, every incident, every time Nancy had harassed me, and it was like reliving it all again, but I needed to do it. Catherine went with me for moral support, and was there, while I filled out the forms and talked to the judge. The order was approved. Nancy was prohibited from approaching me. My house, my work, she had to stay at least 200 meters away. I felt relieved but also sad, you know? Because she was my mom, and part of me still had this foolish hope that someday she would really apologize and we could have some kind of relationship. But that day in court, I knew that was never going to happen. That the Nancy I had known as a child, if she had ever really existed, was gone forever. Arthur and Grace found out about everything, obviously because Catherine told them. And Grace, my grandmother, had to make the hardest decision of her life, I think. She called me crying, saying she was so sorry for what Nancy had done to me, that she had raised her daughter better than that and didn't understand how she'd ended up being like this. And she told me that she and Arthur had decided to cut contact with Nancy for a while, that they couldn't support their own daughter's behavior when she was clearly wrong. That meant they weren't going to see the twins either, which hurt them because they loved their grandchildren. But they felt they had to take a stand. I told them they didn't have to do that I didn't want to be the reason they separated from their daughter. But Arthur said it wasn't my fault. That Nancy had made her own decisions and now had to face the consequences. He said they had watched me work and struggle and build an incredible life from scratch, and they were proud of me, prouder than they could express with words. And when he said that, I started crying on the phone because, after everything that had happened, at least I had Arthur and Grace. At least someone from my biological family valued me. As a way to thank Catherine for everything, for the co-signed loans, for the emotional support, for being there in court with me, I bought her something special. She had mentioned once that she'd always wanted to travel to Italy but had never gone, so I paid for a complete 2-week trip for her, all inclusive, business class flight and nice hotels. When I gave her the gift, she started crying and told me it was too much, but I told her it wasn't even a fraction of what she'd done for me. Without Catherine, I probably wouldn't have been able to go to college, and I definitely wouldn't have gotten where I am now. She was the mom that Nancy never was, even though technically she was my great-aunt. And I thought that was where it all ended. That the restraining order would keep Nancy away and I could get on with my life in peace. But like 3 weeks ago, I received a message on Facebook from someone named Liam. It was one of the twins, the brother, who's now like 20 years old. Imagine that. His message was long and like very careful in how he said things. Basically, it said he'd discovered the whole story of what happened with me, that he'd found old conversations and documents, and that he'd confronted Nancy and Walter about why they'd kicked me out when I was 16. Liam wrote that Nancy had tried to convince him I had been the problematic one, that I had chosen to leave. A whole fake story. But he'd talked to Arthur and Grace too, after Nancy cut contact with them, and they told him the truth. He said he was devastated to know that his existence, his and his sister's, he had been the reason I was kicked out, even though he knew it wasn't his fault because he was just a baby. But he still felt guilty about it, he said. He wrote that he completely understood if I didn't want anything to do with him, that he wouldn't blame me if I ignored him, but that he wanted to apologize on behalf of the family and tell me he admired everything I'd accomplished. He also mentioned that his relationship with Nancy and Walter was very tense now because he couldn't see his parents the same way after knowing what they did to me. He said his twin sister was also upset, but not as much as him, that she was more about keeping peace in the family, but that both of them had decided to look for student loans and work to pay for their college, that they weren't going to accept Nancy harassing me for money. I didn't respond immediately because I didn't know what to say. Honestly. For days I thought about that message. About whether I wanted to have any kind of relationship with Liam or if it was easier to just keep that whole part of my life closed. I talked to Catherine about it, and she told me it was completely my decision, that nobody could tell me what to do, but that maybe Liam deserved a chance because he hadn't done anything wrong, that he was just a kid when everything happened. In the end, I decided to respond. I wrote him something short, saying I appreciated his message, that I had nothing against him or his sister, that I understood they weren't to blame for the decisions Nancy and Walter made. I told him I wasn't ready for a close relationship yet, but that I was willing to talk from time to time, to get to know him a little, and we'd see how things felt. He responded super grateful, saying he completely understood and that we'd do it at my pace, no pressure. We've exchanged some messages since then, nothing deep yet, just like getting to know each other. He told me he's studying engineering, that he likes music, that he has a girlfriend, normal, younger brother stuff, I guess. And it's weird, because part of me feels curious about him, about what it would be like to have a relationship with my half-siblings, but another part of me is still guarded, cautious, because family has disappointed me so much that I don't know if I can trust again. So now here I am, at 33 years old, with a successful career, my own house, people who truly love me, and the possibility of maybe having some kind of relationship with at least one of my half-siblings. Nancy and Walter are still out there somewhere, probably still resentful that I didn't give them money, but with the restraining order, they can't come near me. Arthur and Grace are still my favorite people, although Grace is having health problems and that worries me. Catherine is planning her trip to Italy and sends me pictures of all the places she wants to visit. And I keep processing everything, I guess. There are days when I'm angry, days when I'm sad, and days when I just feel proud of having made it despite everything. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive Nancy. Honestly, I don't think I will, because she didn't just kick me out, but she refused to help me when I needed her most. And then had the nerve to come back only when she needed something from me. That says a lot about who she is as a person. But I think I'm at peace with how things turned out, more or less. I learned that family isn't just blood, that sometimes the people who help you aren't the ones who are supposed to. Arthur, Grace, and Catherine showed me what unconditional love is, real support, and that's worth more than any biological connection. And maybe Liam can be part of that eventually too, not as a replacement for anything but as something new and different. Last week, Liam asked me if someday we could meet in person, like grab coffee or something casual. I didn't say yes yet. I told him, maybe later when I felt ready. And he understood. Said whenever I wanted, he'd be there. And I liked that he respected my boundaries, that he didn't push. Maybe there's hope there. I don't know. But at least it's a start.